So welcome. Welcome to the Australian Sociological Association's Migration, Ethnicity and Multiculturalism October event. So this is part of the NextGen Conversations About series on writing and publishing for early career scholars and also for PhD students. So my name is Ashley Hall. I am one of the co-conveners for TASA's MEM thematic group. And I have graduated with my PhD in sociology from the University of WA just last year. I'm currently an honorary fellow at the Melbourne Social Equity Institute, so I'm wearing both hats today. And I also do some research assistant work in the School of Social and Political Sciences. Both of those are at the University of Melbourne. So I do want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet. I recognise that as we're doing this virtually and from various corners of the globe, it's not just Australia, we are collectively meeting on the lands of many Indigenous people. So I do wish to pay my respects to all of their elders, past, present and emerging, as well as any Aboriginal Indigenous people who may be here today. So we acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. Today's event is part of a series that's being organised by the TASA MEM thematic group. This series is focused on different topics that relate to research in migration, race and multiculturalism, as well as refugee studies. It's the brainchild of MEM's really fantastic postgraduate reps. So I do want to give a shout out to the team because you've all been really fantastic. And also thank you for your hard work in general in just bringing this series together and coming up with all these great concepts for these discussions. So I hope it will continue. And feel free to jump in at any point if you do want to promote, or maybe at the end of the session if you do want to promote any upcoming events or any initiatives that are coming up. So, and I also just want to thank the Melbourne Social Equity Institute who has partnered with us today. And in particular, the really wonderful Claire Smitty, who has done a brilliant job in managing the logistical and technological elements of today's session. She's going to be a fantastic source of support should we encounter any issues today. And just thank you very much, Claire. So we encourage you all to tweet about the session using any of the handles listed here. So the NextGen MEM handle and also Conversations About. And I'll pop those in the chat in a moment so that other people who might join a little bit later can use them as well. And so also, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are recording the session. So it's up to you if you want to leave your cameras on or off. We'll also distribute the recording to everyone who's registered to attend, whether they make it or not. So keep an eye out for this as well. And we'll be able to also upload it to the TASA YouTube channel at a later stage as well, which will be great. So a bit of an overview of who we have presenting today. So we're going to start with Dr. Karen Block from the Melbourne Social Equity Institute, giving advice to early career scholars and higher degree research students who may be publishing for the first time or just getting, or even just thinking about publishing. We also have Dr. Sal Clark from Swinburne University offering the perspective as an early career scholar. Associate Professor Farita from the University of Western Australia. She'll be talking about giving that senior scholar and reviewer perspective, as well as Associate Professor Vince Marotta from Deakin University, who's wearing kind of both hats, a senior scholar and an editor of Journal of Intercultural Studies. And I will, at the end of this, just for about 10 minutes or so, I've got some really great resources that I've come across as an early career scholar that I'll share with you as well. And this will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A to all the speakers where we'll be able to have a bit more of a discussion. And then very last, this is just for anyone who is not completely zoomed out by 3 p.m. and wants to join in, but we are doing an optional co-writing session for anyone who has any project, large or small, that they want to try to move the needle on in a shared space of other people who are doing the same. And I've called it Write That Thing, which is, I know, super unoriginal, but and I'll explain how that works at the beginning for anyone who opts to take part, but it'll be very informal and just with some little blocks of time, 25 minutes each, where we work on any one project and then debrief a little bit at the end and have some breaks in between. So yeah, stay tuned for that one if you have the time or have something that you want to work on after the session. But without further ado, I will I'll introduce our first speaker. I don't know if I've mentioned this, that if you do want to ask a question and you don't want to wait to the end to ask the question, you can actually post it in the chat at any point, and we will monitor those as we go, and then the speakers can either respond in the chat if you want to, otherwise we can leave it to the discussion at the end, especially if it's the kind of question that you might want to have a larger discussion about. And also, if you do want to ask a question more anonymously, you can just make myself or Claire the recipient of your message, and then we'll be able to respond. Or pose the question to the speakers without using your name if you're not comfortable. And so I will get into introducing our first speaker. Dr. Karen Block is the academic lead of the Migration and Social Cohesion Research Program at the Melbourne Social Equity Institute at the University of Melbourne. She's also the academic convener of Melbourne Social Equity Institute's interdisciplinary PhD program in migration, statelessness and refugee studies. So it's all yours, Karen. I will stop sharing. Here we go.
Thank you, Ashley. I'll just get my screen up. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you very much, Ashley, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak today. I too would just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which all of us are meeting. In my case, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So Ashley, as said, the roles that I have with the Melbourne Social Equity Institute, which are around being the co-lead of the Migration and Social Cohesion Research Program, and also the academic convener of an interdisciplinary PhD program that the Institute hosts, focused on migration, statelessness and refugee studies. But my day job is actually in the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health, where I'm based in the Centre for Health Equity, and I do research mostly focused on migration, on migrant and refugees, settlement, social inclusion, and also family violence, increasingly lately. So I'll just start by saying I'm really pleased to be speaking today, and hopefully I've got some useful things to say, but I'm also feeling like I have a bit of imposter syndrome. I'll fess up immediately. I'm not actually a sociologist. I do health sociology, and I certainly draw on sociology a lot, but it's not my background, and I'm based in a school that's in the medical faculty here at the University of Melbourne. And also I'm one of very many academics I know who don't publish anywhere near as much as I would like to. And I guess I'll draw on some of my own struggles when I'm speaking today. Okay, so just moving along. So today I'm just going to speak about three topics really. First of all, I'm really going to focus a lot on publishing for PhD students, but a lot of what I say will be equally relevant for early career researchers. Yeah, I think there's a lot more that will be said for ECR, so I'm going to really talk a fair bit about publishing during your PhD. First of all, why you should do it. Secondly, why you shouldn't be overly concerned about the fact that it always seems like everyone around you is doing more of it than you are, because they're just the people you hear from, and it's not always the case. And then what you should be publishing and how you should be going about it. So first of all, think about why you should publish during your PhD. I mean, I guess it's obvious in some ways that we all know that we need to publish or perish, right? However, it's not the case that everybody is under the same pressure to publish. So certainly if you are interested in an ongoing career in academia, then publishing is really important. It's going to help you enormously get a job post-PhD, and it's just stock in trade for academia. However, many people who do PhDs don't end up in academia, and certainly many of them don't even want to end up in academia. And it's far less obvious why you need to be publishing if your goal is to work at an NGO, for example, where academic publications may not have the same street cred, I guess. So yes, you need to publish, but it's not the same imperative for everybody. I guess one reason why, even if it's not something that is going to help you enormously in your career, reasons why you should think about publishing or why you should publish is so that your research has impact. So we all go into research, well, I think we all go into research hoping to make a difference. We pick a topic that we think is important and we want something to change because of the research that we do. And if you don't publish your work, it's very difficult to have that impact. There's ways of having impact without publishing in academic journals or publishing books, but you certainly have to disseminate your ideas. You have to get your work out there, or you're not going to make any difference to anybody. And very much related to that is, I think it's actually an ethical imperative to get your work out there. I mean, most people have been a lot of people have been funded to do their research. Many of us have research participants whose time is being taken up contributing to our research. We have supervisors and colleagues who also give us their time to assist with our research. So if you simply produce a thesis that gets you a PhD, but you don't actually get your results and your findings out there, then I think that's an ethical failure actually. So it's really an important thing to be doing. There's lots of other really good reasons to publish as well. It can provide a really great opportunity to collaborate and to actually help create networks. When I was doing my PhD, I actually had the opportunity to work with a senior colleague to edit a book on ethics in refugee research. And I ended up being the first editor on that book. And it was a fantastic experience. Not only did I get to work with someone whom I really admired, and it was, a fabulous opportunity to learn from them about how they went about doing such things. I also got to write to all the people whose work I admired and say, would you like to contribute a chapter to our book? So it was a really good way to establish relationships with a whole range of people. So there's lots of really good things you can get out of working together with others to publish. It's important to publish so that you can build a profile in your area. If you want to stay in academia, or even if you don't, even if you want to work somewhere else, it's really helpful to be known as someone who works in a particular area. It leads to all sorts of other opportunities. You'll get asked to present your work, to speak to different audiences, and certainly if you want to stay in academia, it's a vital thing that you need to do, is to actually build a profile in a specific space. While you're working on your PhD, sending work out for publication is a really great opportunity to get feedback as well. So obviously you'll be getting feedback throughout your PhD from supervisors, but if you submit journals to an article, then you're going to get reviewer comments, and it's a really great way to get feedback on your work. So that's another reason to put your work out there. And finally, it's actually kind of fun to publish. I mean, that sounds a bit weird because it's stressful as well, but it's really satisfying, to actually have a piece of work that's out there and published. Yeah, I think it's fun. All right. Okay, so my second point was about why you shouldn't be worrying about what everybody else is doing. It can be really stressful when you're doing a PhD and people are telling you about all the things that they've published and the talks they've been invited to give and the blogs that they've written and all the rest of that. And you can be pretty sure that there's just as many people who haven't published anything at this point and are feeling really stressed about it. So firstly, don't worry about that. Secondly, there's no one right way to do a PhD. There are many people who've done different things throughout the course of their PhD. Some people have just ploughed through, got a thesis, and then turned it into a book, and then moved into a job. Other people will have done lots of teaching, lots of other bits and pieces of work at the same time. There isn't one way to do it, and often your supervisors may think that the way they did it is the way you should do it. That's not necessarily the case. And I would say the first thing to really think about is consider why you are doing a PhD. If it is because you want to work in academia, then make that a conscious that you need to develop strategies around how you're going to get to that place, or try to. There's obviously no sure things. But if your job is, if what you want to do is actually work, say, for an NGO or in government, you might you might want to prioritise other things other than publishing academic journals. You might want to prioritise speaking at community fora. You know, there's a lot of different ways that you can put your work out there that will link you to the kinds of things that you want to do after you finish your PhD. I think another thing that we need to think about with a PhD, and this certainly doesn't stop at the end of your PhD, is the very many competing demands that we all have. So not only are you trying to finish your PhD, or if you're an ECR, you often do some other piece of research that someone has employed you to do. Many of us will be teaching as well. Sometimes we have to do other things while we're doing a PhD in order to just earn enough income. We generally, within a university, will be expected to undertake various service and leadership tasks. We might need to be thinking about developing our networks to help us in the next step of our careers. It can be a really hard job managing your supervisors. You know, that's often a really tricky thing to do. And of course, you know, we have families, we have lives, and we like to take holidays. So there's many, and it's really important that you do prioritise all those things as well, and that you're not, that you don't burn out, I guess, throughout your PhD. The last point about that, however, though, you know, given that we do need to publish, or we need to publish in some form during or soon after our PhD, is around how do you find time to do it? And I would say that you never find the time. The time never just miraculously appears. You have to make the time, and it's really difficult. It's one of the most difficult things that I certainly struggle with. And it's really worth, I think, talking to people, you know, who do successfully publish a lot, and finding out what they do. I know lots of people with lots of different strategies. I know one person who writes for the first 2 hours of every day. They're quite a senior scholar. They treat that as if it were a teaching appointment that can't be interrupted. So they will not take meetings or phone calls during that time. It's writing time, and you can get a surprising amount done in 2 hours of every day if that's uninterrupted time. I know other people who just make sure that they write at least 100 words every day, and often, of course, they'll write more than 100 words. But if you actually begin writing, that's the hardest bit, getting those first few words out at any one time. Other people will set aside, you know, 1 day a week or a whole week, once a month. You know, there are different ways, but you've got to make the time. It doesn't just fall into your lap. Okay, so just in terms of what you publish and how you go about it, as I said before, you know, often journal articles are really important in academia. Depending on your discipline, books may also be highly valued. In my area in population health, books are not particularly common at all, but they're much more common in sociology and in lots of other disciplines. And it's really important to understand, I guess, the discipline that you're situated in, but also different institutions and different countries will have different priorities as well. So, for example, I read somewhere recently that in Germany, teaching, if you want a career in academia, you need to be teaching during your PhD. Whereas in Australia, that may or may not be important, depending on the kind of academic job you want to try and go into. Different institutions and different disciplines may also have different ideas about quality of publishing over quantity of publishing. So obviously a good long list of publications always looks great, but if they're not in good quality journals, that may not get you as much credibility as if they are. Different disciplines and different institutions also give different weightings to first authorship or single authorship versus multiple authorship. So again, in my field, in population health, it's common to have many authors, and that's not something that you would almost look at somebody with a single author paper and think, oh, that's strange, they must not be very collaborative. It's really common and usual to have many authors on a paper. However, first authorship is extremely highly valued. Also in some sciences in particular, being last author on a paper shows your seniority. So first or last tends to be are the best places in an authorship list for some disciplines. So it's really important to understand your discipline and understand where you want to be positioned before you make decisions around things like that. I've already mentioned about journal articles or books. Again, that they have different weightings and different values in different disciplines and institutions. And of course, there's many other ways to disseminate your work other than through academic publications. So blogs, print media, podcasts, social media, and are all really excellent way. And of course, conference presentations or presenting at you might have opportunities to present for PD sessions at organisations. There's a whole lot of different places you can put your work out there. And these are all extremely important as well, particularly if you're trying to develop those networks and develop that profile. And even if you are doing academic publications, it's always a great idea to write a blog about it as well, for example, or to try to get some media interest in what you're writing, because that's going to increase the number of people who see it, the number of people who notice it, and increase its impact. So of course, in recent years, one of the best ways to publish during a PhD is by doing a thesis with or by publication. So different institutions have different rules about this. And here at the University of Melbourne, we actually, it's called thesis by publication, which means you can have one or more journal articles within your thesis, but you still have to have a thesis beginning that includes your literature review and an end that includes your discussion. But some other institutions, you can publish your whole thesis, can consist of publications. So you need to know the rules, of course, and there's some really great advantages to doing a thesis by publication. I mean, it means you will definitely finish your thesis with publications by the time you graduate. And it's also a great way to achieve some of the other things we've talked about, like collaborating with others, co-authorship, building a profile, and so forth. It's not for everyone though, and again, it depends very much on your discipline. It may not be seen as a good thing, and it may not be possible depending on the type of research that you're doing. If you're doing a type of project that really needs to be seen as one whole, rather than that's not easily kind of carved up into pieces, then it may not be the most suitable thing for you. So it's something to talk to your supervisors about. And in fact, all of these things are things to talk to your supervisors about.
Karen, just a note that you're at 1 minute now.
Oh, it's done.
1 minute warning. Thank you.
So I think other people are going to talk about co-authorship as well. So I'll maybe just skip over that. Just in terms of choosing a journal, that's another thing to talk to your supervisors about. There are a lot of things to take into account. I would say always try to choose a good quality journal, and there are different ways that journal quality is assessed. One of those is you can look up on a website, Skimago, and it will tell you whether it's a Q1, the highest quartile journal, and so forth. You can always start at the top, and you can always work your way down if you don't get accepted at first. So I'm definitely running out of time. Sorry, actually, I thought I was going to get a 5-minute warning, so I wasn't ready.
Sorry about that, Karen.
I'll just talk to one more point that I've got there, which is just about responding to reviewer comments and criticisms and dealing with your emotions. It's a really hard thing to put yourself out there in print emotionally. It's sort of you stating this is my academic identity, and so can be really hard not to take reviewer comments and criticisms quite personally. My top tip is put them away in a drawer for a few days until you've calmed down after the first time you read them, when you tend to go, oh, that's so ridiculous, they just didn't get me. But then also just understand it as this is what academia is about, and this is kind of what we do as academics, and it's sometimes not very nice, is we critique things, and reviewers are there to do that. So it's really important that you understand that it is an emotional experience, but also that you by understanding that, are able to put that aside and just keep calm when you're responding. So I'll leave it there, and I can also obviously talk more later in question time. Thanks. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you, Karen. I had meant to warn you at the 2-minute mark, but I was responding to one of the chat questions, so apologies for that. We might stick to about a 2 or 3 minute warning. I'll gauge how we're going for time as we go. But I will now introduce Dr. Sal Clark. They're a lecturer at Swinburne University in the School of Art, Social Sciences and Humanities. Sal comes from an interdisciplinary background incorporating political theory with sociological methods, with research interests that encompass forced migration, human rights, bordering practices, and also the intersection of race, gender, and the politics of displacement and exceptionality. So take it away, Sal.
Thank you. So before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the people of the Gadigal Nation on whose lands I'm currently residing. And I would also pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I also would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on whose lands I usually work and reside. And just to recognise that the land was never ceded, that it always was, it always will be Aboriginal land. And I also want to thank Ashley and Claire for inviting me today to speak at this event. It's really nice to, particularly in this kind of context, to be able to link in and talk to people. So just for some context, I am less than 12 months into my first full-time level B teaching and research role at Swinburne University. So I'm still very much a newbie. I'm an ECR who's trying to navigate their way through this weird career stage in a particularly challenging and strange 2020 environment. So I'm still absolutely learning as I go and trying to find my way. So I thought that what I would like to focus on today is the things that I wish I had known, during my PhD or, starting out. And I wanted to share with you just some of the things that I've learned along the way, through my academic journey, going from someone who was actually first in family, even attending university, moving to being a PhD candidate, to then, a tenured lecturer. And I think that some of these accounts will probably be very familiar to some of you, that, that trying to break into academia that can feel so closed down and, navigating that incredibly precarious situation. So I wanted to kind of share some of the things that I guess I have learned but wish I had known sooner or clicked onto sooner. So I thought I would leave more of the technical advice around publishing to my more experienced colleagues here today and just focus on those types of things. So when I was first asked by Ashley to participate today, I actually thought really long and hard about how I wanted to frame this, because I've attended a lot of these types of events myself, both as a PhD candidate and as an ECR. And to be honest, I often left them feeling incredibly frustrated. I would be frustrated because they would either be really overwhelmingly positive to the point where I'm like, at what stage did you lose touch with academic reality? Just last week, I had an executive at my university give a talk to a bunch of ECRs and PhD candidates, regaling them about the story about how she got her first full-time job after giving a presentation on her PhD results, and then walked into a full-time lecturing gig, and then was quickly promoted to a senior lecturer after giving an internal presentation, and with a bit of a wink and a nod said, so don't worry, all you need to do is get out there and you'll all be fine. And you can see the faces of everyone in the room just kind of seething with rage almost at like that idea that it kind of places the blame on individuals for not succeeding, because why can't you succeed? Because we all did. On the other hand, though, you sometimes get these really pessimistic accounts where people they point to the statistics and tell you you're never going to get a job and that it's all hopeless and academia is terrible and you're not going to have a work-life balance. And that can be just as depressing as well. And I don't think that that's helpful. And I don't think that either extreme really characterizes modern day university. It is a very hard career, but it can also be a very rewarding one. And there still are opportunities there for people. But I think what you need is to know and have good strategies for kind of trying to minimize the free work that you do and maximize the outputs that you achieve. So, I feel very privileged to have a tenured role in this current environment, but along with that comes a great amount of imposter syndrome. So it was interesting to hear Karen even say, speaking at something that's tagged as a sociology conference, that, you feel imposter syndrome. I feel that way when I look around and I think about how many deserving people there are and how much people are publishing and all this great work they're doing. I'm like, well, why do I have this opportunity? And I think that that's probably one of the biggest things that's held me back. And I think that's going to be the focus of my talk today, is that my biggest barrier has been myself and my lack of confidence in publishing. So, like I said, I spent a lot of time being precariously employed, you know, taking on many sessional jobs across many universities and seizing any research assistant role that I possibly could, regardless of whether it fit a broader narrative, the story and the career that I was personally trying to, you know, create. So these are basically the things that I wish I had known at the time. I wish that I had known the value of my early work. I think that, as Karen mentioned, there is a desire as a PhD student or as an ECR to just, you know, flesh out that CV. You want to get as many runs on the board as possible. And I think early on, that desire to get those runs on the board meant that I undervalued my own work, and I sent it to just any kind of place that I thought would publish it. And when I look back now, I realized that some of that work that I was doing during my PhD, kind of uninterrupted by all the other pressures, is better than the stuff that I'm probably publishing now in Q1 journals. But it was a lack of confidence in my own work at the time to send it out to those more prestigious journals. I kind of did the reviewer's job for them of knocking down my own work. And so something that I've learned is to actually let the world do that. There's enough people in the world who are going to try and knock you down. I don't need to do that to myself preemptively. So I've really tried to make a commitment to myself to always send my work off to the highest possible journal, and then work, you know, if they reject it, that's fine, and I will work my way down. But I always will start as high as possible. Even recently on an article I've been working on for years now, and it's just been destroying me, I was just so ready to just send it off, just so it was off my desk and I never have to think about it again. And luckily I had some good colleagues in the same shut up and write session with me who were like, don't you dare do that. Promise us right now you will not do that. You've spent too long to just send that off to a random online unrecognized journal. You've worked on this for a reason. You've said these things for a reason. It's got value in it. Don't you dare just send it off somewhere where no one's going to read it. And I was like, we're not doing that. Okay. So that's one thing. I think I was also part of being a little gun shy around all this, apart from feeling incredibly like that imposter syndrome and like I didn't belong in academia. I think part of it came from the fact that I did have some negative experiences early on in my PhD, which I don't think are representative of academia more broadly. But I definitely had some people try and almost scare me off my research area by telling me it was useless and not very interesting and that no one cares about it. I shouldn't bother. And I think I took that on board and I backed off from it. And I didn't publish in that area, only for those same people to then move in and publish in that area in the next few years. And that was a really horrible lesson to learn, but I'm glad I learned it early on because it made me realize that people always have their own agendas come to these things. And like I said, most of my experiences in academia have been incredibly collegial and positive, but it made me realize that old saying that you should never, take criticism from someone you wouldn't take advice from. And I realized that in that instance, I let someone else and their own kind of agenda dictate what I was doing. And I let them kind of push me out of an area. So just having that confidence in yourself and the work that you're doing. I also want to talk a bit about co-publishing. And this is something that me and Ashley kind of had a conversation about recently. Again, with trying to get runs on the board, I think there is this idea that you have to be solo authoring papers, and that's how you distinguish yourself. And I think in doing this, we often instill in our PhD students a kind of idea, a misleading idea that co-publishing is somehow bad or less valuable. Apart from the fact that co-publishing and working in teams can be incredibly joyous and engaging, co-publishing is actually really fundamental these days. If you get to the stage where you're looking to apply for grants, or you're trying to write a rope section for an ECR, for an ARC grant or one of those types of things, they're going to look at who you have worked with. They're not just looking at, what you've done. And working with people who are on the same level as you, so like me and Ashley working on something together after meeting at a conference, but also working with people who are more senior than you as well. This can be really valuable not only do you benefit from their guidance and their mentorship, when you publish with someone more senior than you, you get the benefit of their built-in audience and that exposure that they bring with them. And I think that we have in this, I think it harkens back to an old school academia where we think that it's all about sitting cloistered off in our own offices, just turning out papers. And I think the more new school academia is actually more about teams and collaboration and working together. And I think that employers are actually going to look at your capacity to be collegial and work with others and see that as a benefit, not as a, not as a negative against you, that you don't have a huge list of solid published papers. And one thing that a very good mentor of mine has drilled into me too, that speaks to working with others, is don't sit back and expect that those opportunities are just going to come to you. Everyone's sitting in their office thinking, well, I do that work. Why wasn't I invited into that team? Or why wasn't I on that paper? That's what I do. But if everyone does it, then no one actually reaches out to each other. And I think one of the best things you can do as a PhD student or as an ECR is to network as hard as possible and to get in contact with people. If you like their work, get in touch. And I say that as someone who is incredibly introverted and would way prefer to go and eat my lunch in the car park at the conference than have awkward conversations around the coffee machine. I think the biggest, my career has probably accelerated the most when I realized that I had to get over that. And that hanging back wasn't doing me any favors. But working with people, and not just working with people within your own little discipline or department, but as broadly as possible, because I think some of the best and most interesting research opportunities that have come across my desk in the last 12 months have not been through traditional research pathways, but it's been just through working with people on other types of projects. And they know your name and they know who you are. And so then when this opportunity pops up, they're like, oh, okay, I like working with this person. I know this person. I know their work ethic. And so people are more likely to try and take you with them if they already know who you are and what you do. So I think that is a really fundamental thing, that we need to move just outside of our little kind of cloistered off areas and work as broadly and network as broadly as we can.
I don't know why, but you're muted, Sal. I'm just giving you a 2-minute warning as well. I don't know how that, there we go.
Cool. All right, so then the final point that I'll make then, in terms of trying to overcome this imposter syndrome, is despite my own personality, I've become a real joiner, I've realized, in the last couple of years. I've really gotten involved at every possible opportunity. And if that means just going to seminars, that like internal ones at the university, attending every workshop, taking every single opportunity, or taking advantage of any training that is available, you know, even if it's going to the in vivo training, like just any opportunity possible, signing up for like mentoring opportunities. I think in the last few years, I must have sent an email that started with the lines, is this open or available to sessionals? Like thousands of times. And if they said yes, and I'd be like, great, is there funding available for us to attend? Like, I think I became incredibly bolshy in that kind of approach to just getting involved. And again, I think that really helped networking beyond my initial pool of people who I work with. And these are the things that pay off. And I know that that's not maybe specifically related to research outputs, but again, these are how research opportunities and teams have been built and formed, and connections, work connections have been created that I think are beneficial for a much more long-term kind of prosperity. So I think that I'll probably leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Sal. I just realized it was probably me that accidentally muted you instead of unmuting myself before, so apologies for that. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I think I think that would have resonated with a lot of people, the stuff about the imposter syndrome and the introversion sometimes kind of gets in our way when we're afraid of approaching people we might see as being the kind of big names, and we don't want to sound like we're fangirling them. But at the risk of doing that myself, it was I was tickled when you said that you're working with someone that you consider on your level, because I consider you like at least a couple of levels above me, at the risk of fangirling myself. So thank you. But that's, yeah, no, that was really lovely, and some real good real talk about the realities of what it's really like when you're new and you're navigating all of this stuff for the, at such an early stage. So thank you so much. We will now move on to Associate Professor Farita Foster from the University of Western Australia School of Social Sciences. Farita is a sociologist with a research focus on migration, race and ethnicity, as well as refugee settlement, racism, nationalism and cosmopolitanism. So we're all yours, Farita, when you're ready.
Thanks, Ashley. So greetings from Perth. We're 3 hours behind you guys, so it's about 10:45, about morning tea time here. I'm speaking to you from Wajak Noongar land. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that we are all migrants on this land. Now, as we were getting ready for the session this morning, we all kind of joined 15 minutes early, and people were testing their slides. And I realized that, everybody's saying more or less what I was going to say. So what I'm going to do is to kind of go through the points that I had wanted to make, and then emphasize a few things, because I was being asked to speak sort of as a more senior person, although I do have to say that you never get over the imposter syndrome thing, so just get used to it. And also a little bit from a reviewer's perspective as well. And I'm happy today because this morning when I woke up, I opened my email and an article was just accepted, and it's an article which it's been a long time in the making. And so from this particular journal, we have had, thank you for the applause, Ashley. We've had 3 sets of reviewers on this article. We've back and forth with it 3 times, and each time it has definitely improved, but it is a long process. And so there's something to be said for what my mum used to call stick-to-itiveness, that you just have to keep at it, basically. So this article was initially rejected by Vince. Thanks, Vince. And now it's finally going to be published. So just keep at it. Okay, so I'll just go through kind of the list of things that I wanted to talk about briefly, and I'll talk more about the things that haven't been covered. So I want to talk about prioritising time, making the same point that Karen did. Why undertake research if you're not going to communicate it? Okay, so it's a fundamental part of the research process. Your research has not finished just by writing it up. Your research finishes, and maybe it never finishes, by actually getting it published. As I know a lot of people who've tuned in are PhD students, when you're thinking about publishing, you need to think about your PhD as chunks rather than as a whole PhD. So you're never going to be able to kind of write an article that encapsulates everything that you found in your PhD. So think about how to chunk your PhD up into bite-sized pieces that carry more or less a single narrative, which will make an argument. And you will find that you will have a lot of potential papers out of that. And also to make the point that doesn't preclude you from then publishing the whole thing as a book as well. You don't want to have everything published as papers, but certainly you can have some of what might become a monograph at the end of your PhD already published as papers. That's fine. Often you can get multiple papers out of one bit of your thesis or out of kind of one idea. So I often encourage people to think about, is there a way that you can actually expand a lit review so that you get a whole paper out of a lit review, so that the paper is reviewing the literature on a particular topic or area. So that, that can be one paper in itself. And usually, you would need to think about how you can frame that. in a way that demonstrates that this is a contribution to knowledge. This is something new that other people haven't done. So you'll be synthesizing and analyzing the literature in a way that is not just descriptive, but is adding something to the literature that already exists. So that's kind of one paper. You also might have done something really interesting methodologically. And sometimes you can get a paper out of the method that you've been using for your PhD or whatever your research has been. Is there some interesting angle that you have used? Sometimes you've encountered interesting methodological challenges, particularly ethical challenges. So some colleagues in New Zealand and I recently had a paper published about photo voice. So we had both used the same method on more or less the same topic. They had used a method that I had developed and used here. But they had a completely different experience in terms of their kind of ethics approval process. So their ethics committee at their university basically refused them permission to undertake the research in the way that I had been allowed to undertake it, given at my ethics committee here in Western Australia. So we actually wrote a paper about that. That was, it was an interesting case study, which might be of interest to other people. So that's another paper that you can get out of it. And then you can get your paper, which is basically about your data, but again, chunking your data up so that you're focusing on a particular element or aspect. So be creative, think about the range of, I don't know about you, but whenever I start writing, my papers blow out past 10,000 words very, very easily. And so that's the point at which you think, okay, does all this fit in one paper, or am I actually writing 2 or 3 papers in one? Craft your title and your abstract carefully. As a reviewer, I'm going to be drawn or kind of lose interest at the point of kind of abstract and title. So as you know, as a sociologist, you must always have a colon in your paper titles. Often you're required to use a quote. You might want to use a quote from one of your participants. These are kind of interesting ways to grab people's attention and interest. The abstract should describe what the paper is about. Sciencey abstracts have a very particular structure to them. We tend not to do that within sociology and social sciences more generally. But you do still need to say what it is that your paper is about. So you can start with something that's going to grab people's attention, but then you need to say what your paper is arguing, what method you used, and what sort of conclusions you drew. Also think about the opening of the paper itself, okay? Because the reviewer goes from title abstract into the first bit of your paper, and if they're not kind of grabbed by that, then they're reading it for a reason to exclude it. And we know that journals, they want the reviewers to exclude. They're getting thousands of papers each year. They're wanting their reviewers, and they like reviewers who will say no, who will reject your paper. So, the reviewer reads it through that lens. So you want to engage them, not to make them lose interest. Tell a story in the way that you're writing. So think about the narrative. Take the reader with you, take the reader by the hand and carry them along the narrative that you are telling. So it's not just about presenting your data, it's about telling the reader, what does that data mean? What is that story? And of course, you have to relate that story back to the literature. So, and this is fundamental, and also as a reviewer, it's really important. We want to know how is this significant? How is what you're telling me different from what I've already read? Okay, so we're all working, because we're all members of MEM, we're working within the area of migration, multiculturalism, ethnicity, etc. There has been a shitload that has been written about this topic, particularly in Australia. You will notice at international sociology conferences that there are these kind of clusters of Australian scholars working in this area. So unless you can demonstrate that what you're saying is something slightly different from what everybody else has already done, then that's going to be another kind of reason to exclude. So think about how you're going to tell that story about why your work is significant, how it contributes to the existing debates that have been going on in the literature. So yes, you're demonstrating your knowledge of the literature, but also what are you adding to that? What's your added contribution? Think about the journal. So what is the appropriate outlet for your paper? Is it, yeah, so you know, have a look at the journal's kind of aims and objectives, etc. Have a look at the editorial board. You know, you should recognize some of the names. One of the tricks is, if you know this is the journal you want to publish your work, make sure that your paper references some other papers from that journal. Okay, there's no point in referencing a bunch of other journals, because this journal is interested in its impact factor. Okay, so make sure that you're referencing some of the articles from that same journal. And I want to emphasize the point that has been made a couple of times already. Do not aim too low. I see this really often when I'm looking at CVs and you know, for, making appointments, etc. That, again, partly because of imposter syndrome, but partly because, I don't know, because you're a junior, because you're a woman, because, you know, there's all sorts of reasons that we think, oh, well, you know, I'll just, I don't think it's that important what I'm saying, so I'm just going to aim low. And, you know, the quality of your work is probably better than that. And there's no harm in aiming high. So send it to an international journal and, you know, they can reject it. They can do the work of rejecting it, and then kind of work your way down in terms of the tiers of the journals. Do have a look at the impact factor of journals, their rankings. Use Samago, ISI, Web of Science rankings. Be careful of predatory journals. If you are approached by, you know, at random, out of the blue, cold, by a journal, be careful about it, okay? Because reputable journals, they don't need to seek academics to publish.
Just a 2-minute warning, Farita.
2 minutes, all right. Again, just bits and pieces of stuff. When you're writing, give enough about your method in the article, but not too much, okay? So when you're turning something from a PhD into an article, you don't want that whole big chunk of method in there. So you have to work out what is important, what's going to convince the reader that you know what you're talking about, that your method has been undertaken to suggest validity and reliability, etc. And also let them know how you undertook your analysis as well, okay? Because that's often the stuff that reviewers will come back with. Get feedback from your buddies. So before you send it away to an article, to a journal, run it past some of your peers, whether they're PhD buddies, whether they're ECR buddies, whether they're more senior academics who you respect. Get feedback yourself first, so that what you're presenting to the journal is the best version of what it can be. Make sure you proof before you send it in. That turns reviewers off straight away if there are grammatical errors, spelling, punctuation errors, etc. Make sure you fix that up. Point I started with, if at first you don't succeed, just keep on trying, okay? It might have gotten rejected from one place, so just send it to another one. Just keep on at it. Dealing with reviewer feedback has already been covered, but just do take the time to respond. Don't presume that you have to accept all of the feedback. Feel confident that you can challenge. You know, often you'll get reviewers who are saying, yeah, I didn't like that paper, I'd like them to write this paper. Okay, so they actually want you to have written a different paper. And so, you know, you can push back a little bit, but don't push back on everything. Okay, so you need to try to address at least 3/4 of the feedback, but you are allowed to push back on it, but you need to explain you are. Now, when I was doing a little research to think about the sorts of things to say, one of the things that came up was to write a good cover letter. Now, I have to say, I've lost count, but it's probably, I don't know, 70 or 80 publications, I've never ever written a cover letter. You know, when you're submitting, it has a space for a cover letter. And I'm wondering about that now, whether it's necessary or not. So the advice is write a cover letter which is going to convince the editor to at least send it on to reviewers. And in that cover letter, you need to convince the editor to that your article fits with the aims and objectives of that particular journal, and that it's contributing something new. So jury's still out on that. I'm not sure I'm convinced. I think I'm going to stop there because I don't want to go over time. I did have some things that I wanted to say about joint publication, co-authoring, and publishing thesis by publication from the perspective of a supervisor, but maybe that's something that we could come back to during the
I was going to say, Farita, I'm happy to give you another minute because I can always shave off a little bit from my part later, which is not anywhere near as important. So I would actually love to hear about this. So go for it. I'll give you another.
All right. I might just say a little bit about co-authorship from the supervisor's perspective. So I've had students who I've co-authored with after the fact, and I've had students that I've co-authored with. I had a PhD that was associated with my future fellowship, and that PhD, it was a PhD by publication. There are challenges to doing PhDs by publication. One of them is the length of time it takes to get papers actually published. Okay, so by the time you've written it up and then sent it out to reviewers and so on, it can push the length of the thesis out quite significantly. So that's one thing to be careful of. You are also being held to a much higher standard than just for a PhD. So when examiners look at a PhD, they know this is a PhD. They know it's done by an early career researcher, and they're quite kind of generous in the way that they assess it. When you send an article out, they don't know that you're an early career researcher. They don't know this is your first journal article. And so they will come back with much more criticism than if they were just examining a PhD. So these are things to be a little bit careful of. On the other hand, it's a benefit, of course, to the student because they're getting publications while they're doing their PhD, but it's also of benefit, and this is feedback that I've had from students that I've published with, but it's sort of like an apprenticeship because writing for publication is different from writing a PhD, which is a point Ashley made earlier. And so seeing how a more senior academic crafts an article, responds to reviewers' feedback, etc., that apparently, and this is from students giving me feedback, can be of value. Okay, yeah, I think those are sort of the main points that I wanted to make. Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you. So much amazing practical advice in there. I wrote down some very vigorous notes. I think the breaking PhD into many bite-sized pieces is probably something a lot of people here can relate to. I see it come up a lot as a question in a couple of groups that I'm in, a couple of sort of supportive environments that I'm part of. A lot of people are trying to cram in entire master's or PhD thesis into a one article because they think they have to do that. And so it does come up a lot. And yeah, I've been realizing there's so much I wanted to say in my PhD that I wasn't able to. And most of my articles are actually really unraveling stuff that I didn't even really talk about much in the PhD at all. So I think that that's a really good point that you made. And there's so many, but we will move on to Vince now. But thank you so much, Farita. So Vince Marotta is our final speaker in this formal part of it. I will do a little bit of an informal spiel of some good resources at the end, but Associate Professor Vince Marotta is Coordinator of Publishing and Mentorship at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation. And he's also a Senior Lecturer in Sociology at Deakin University School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Vince is also managing editor of the Journal of Intercultural Studies. So I'm very much, I'm sure most of us, everybody here is looking forward to your perspective from the editor's perspective, as well as writing and doing your own, getting your own research out there, Vince. So I'll let you take the floor.
Thank you very much. So I'd also like to acknowledge the First Nations, not only within Melbourne, but across Australia and globally as well, and acknowledge and pay my respect to the elders past and also emerging. And firstly, I want to apologise to Farita for rejecting her article. I'm not quite sure. Was this for our journal? Was this for the Journal of Intercultural Studies? It was. But it is now accepted, is it? Is it now accepted? All right, well, yeah, you get in these situations. All right, so I think once again, I think some of my points may overlap, so I might rush through some of those. So I am trying to come from an editor's perspective. So I'll just share my screen, if that's possible. Sorry.
Just the slideshow one along the top, if you can. Oh, there we go.
So some of these are already been covered, so I might not go into any great detail, but maybe focus a little bit more on which journal you should publish in from my perspective at least, and the so-called indicators of quality. And from an editor's perspective, once again, one has to be aware of who your audience is and who you're writing for. And Farita and Karen has also mentioned some of these, responding to reviewers' comments, but I'll make some further comments on that. And I might not talk about a single authorship or co-authorship that's been addressed already. So as Ashley has pointed out, I'm one of the co-editors of the Journal of Intercultural Studies, but also a series editor of the Anthem series called Global Migration in the Asian Pacific. And just briefly, in terms of my own background and how I got into the role of editor and being involved in journals and so forth. You know, it's not something that I planned from the beginning, and it was something that was, you know, in some case pushed upon me, and others, I was just there at the right time. And so I might give you a little history about the journal, because the journal, when I took over about 15 years ago, was on its last leg, and it was at Monash University. And initially, somebody asked me whether I wanted to be a book review editor, and I thought, well, and I was finishing off my PhD, I think, at that stage. So, and by the way, my PhD took me 7.5 years, nearly 8 years to complete. So somebody just, do I want to be, you know, the book review editor? And I thought, well, this is a good opportunity, you know. So I took that role, and then at one stage, Monash decided they didn't want the journal anymore. Routledge was about to pull the plug, and I said, well, if nobody else wants it, and that's what it was, nobody else wanted the journal, I said, well, I'm happy to take over, you know. And I had some previous experience with a journal called Thesis 11, which my supervisor was an editor of, and he encouraged me to be involved in a sort of editorial process. And so anyway, so I just fell into the job, so to speak. And I was we were one of those journals that were emailing people and asking them, do you want to publish with us? Do you really want to publish with us? You know, and a lot of Australian scholars were saying, the Journal of Intercultural Studies, I don't know what that is, you know? So anyway, so just to give you an indication of my journey as an editor. So, all right, let's move forward. So let me just see, why should I publish? I think most that's been covered already. You know, I think Karen already mentioned about the dissemination of your work, you know, and your work is important. So I think it's important to you know, sharing your work, disseminating your work, and telling people that you're out there, and that your work is valuable, and is interesting, and is original. You know, so I think that's important questions, important reasons why you should. You know, once again, I think Farita did mention some of this. The PhD is not written like a journal article, and so this is coming from my perspective as the editor. You know, sometimes you know this is a PhD student that is just submitting their chapter, right? Because it reads like a chapter, right? So be careful of that. That's one of the things I would encourage you not to do, to just cut and paste your chapter and put it in as an article. So it takes a lot more work to convert chapters into journal articles. And, you know, HDR should be talking with the supervisors about submission. So that's already been covered. Once again, ECRs, I know that a lot of ECRs, as Sal was talking about, isolate themselves and don't feel confident in talking to others and making networks. But, you know, as with what Sal said, I think you know, you should force yourself to network. And I've had that experience where you're at conferences and you feel like, you know, should I really be here? And it's really hard to step up and talk to people around the coffee table and so forth. But yeah, I think that's an important advice by Sal. All right. So what type of publication? You know, I think there are various ways to disseminate your work, and I think Karen mentioned this. But I'm really focused on the journal article in particular from an editor's perspective. And of course, you can publish book chapters and obviously a book from your PhD. And I did have an example, but I might not get into that at the moment. And, you know, I think in terms of the book proposal, you know, at least from the perspective of Anthem Press and a lot of other publishers, you know, they want to know what you're contributing to the field, and what are the competitors. In other words, what are other books out in the field that may be a competitor to yours, and you know, who is your audience, and the more the better for publishers, apart from academics, you know, people working in the policy areas, NGOs. So from a publisher perspective, the more your book speaks to multiple audiences, the better it is for the publishers, at least. So that's just my take on that in terms of my role as a series editor. So what type of publication can you submit to a scholarly journal? Now, you know, from the Journal of Intercultural Studies, we accept various ways of you can disseminate your work. So obviously the substantial article, which is about 6,000 to 8,000 words, but we also accept discussion pieces. So, you know, if you have a particular issue that you want to talk about, which is coming from your research, and you want to write a 2,000 word piece or 2,500 word discussion piece, you know, and we do accept those, and, you know, they're almost like the conversation pieces. So, you know, so we're not too, we don't send these discussion pieces to reviewers. It's a sort of in-house reviewing process. And that also relates to research notes. So, for example, you know, you might want to talk about a particular research field that is becoming prominent in your area, a network, a research network that is emerging around a particular topic. So, you know, we're more than happy to publish those. Once again, they're not refereed. They're it's an internal process. So you can't really acknowledge that as a publication. We don't treat it as a refereed piece. And of course, you can do review essays. Now, we don't get enough of those, and review essays are quite popular. So this is where you bring together you know, 2 or 3 books, and you talk about these 3 books in a ways that the major themes coming out of those books, the major issues, the major limitations of those books, the ways these books speak to particular theoretical or conceptual issues. So we do encourage review essays, and as I said, they're very popular. They get a lot of downloads. So this is why we encourage them. So if you're thinking about, you know, if you've written, obviously in your PhD, you've read many books and many articles, and in particular if they're contemporary, you know, in the last 2 or 3 years, then you know, I think you should seriously look at that. And of course, the last thing is the book review. And you know, I started my publication profile with doing a couple of book reviews. Firstly, for my supervisor's journal, which is Thesis 11, but also in other journals as well. And it does slowly introduce you to the sort of process, the publication process that occurs, and dealing with editors and dealing with book review editors. So I think that for me, that was a really good experience. So the other thing is about which journal. I think some of you may have mentioned, the other presenters may have mentioned this. So questions to ask yourself, I think it's very important to, you know, what is my research field? So if we're talking about our thematic group, so obviously our research field is migration and ethnic studies, but within that, there are subfields. So that's the sort of question you should ask yourself. Within this field, are there subfields? And do I work across these subfields? And do I submit to a national, international journal? And I think, you know, Farita talked about, you know, I think you should go for the Q1. And if those Q1s are international journals, then why not? Do I direct my paper to a specialist or generalist journals? Should I go for top, middle, lower tier? These are questions you need to ask yourself. And if you're a PhD student, then obviously that discussion comes along with your supervisor as well. And who is my target audience? So I just want to really briefly talk about these ones. So, you know, what is my subfield? You know, I think there are various generalist journals. The Journal of Sociology is one of those, which is connected to TASA, the Australian Journal of Anthropology, the European Journal of Cultural Studies. You know, the European Journal of Cultural Studies.
Just your 2-minute warning,
Oh,
sorry.
So that's fine. So, you know, have a look at those. There's specialised journals, refugees, studies, cultural identities, you know, so there's a wide range, and I think you have to decide, you know, where does my paper really reside. So let me just move forward. Most of this is being already discussed. How to decide which journal with your area of expertise, by the reputation of the journal. So we've already, a few of us have already talked about reputation. So in our neoliberal research culture, usually this reputation is based on metrics such as citations. So you have a look at that. I've mentioned, others have already mentioned Smargo. Have a look at the journal ranking. You can also look at the rejection rates. These are not well publicised. I know for our journal, the rejection rate is about 80%, right? So 80% get rejected in the initial screening. So when myself and my other co-editor, Paula, read the articles that first come in, we do have about an 80% rejection rate. If you're being strategic, you may want to focus on the journal's turnaround time. So you may, I know some academics or scholars email us saying, you know, what is your turnaround time? You know, because they don't want to wait 2 years. So, you know, the standard practice is about 3 to 6 months to receive your referees' reports. This depends on multiple factors, our editor screening, finding reviewers, how long the reviewers take to get back to us. We usually give them 3 to 6 weeks, but that's not always occurs. If things don't go to plan, then it may take 4 to 6 months before we receive reports. Then, you know, it may take up to 6 to 8 months before publication, and that's the ideal situation. Now, I've heard a lot of other academics talk about, you know, 1.5 years to 2 years. We try to publish as soon as possible. You know, for us, it can be 10 to 12 months before your article was published. Other indicators of quality: submit the journals you read and cite most often. I mean, if you think they're important, then I think you should submit to those journals. And obviously, who your colleagues are citing. You know, other qualities is, is the journal sponsored by learned societies? You know, Journal of Sociology is connected to the Australian Sociological Association. Who's on the editorial board? Already mentioned. You know, this is a given. Are they double peer reviewed? Now, open access journal. I don't think that open access journals are bad in and of themselves. You know, are they connected to a major academic publishing company? You have to look at that. Should they be? Well, you know, I think Critical Race Whiteness Studies Journal is a really highly regarded journal. And if you look at their editorial board, they've got some excellent leading scholars in the field. And so this is an open access journal, right? And so from my perspective, I would want to publish in that, right? That doesn't mean that's the only thing you publish on, but don't forget about these really important open access journals. The politics of paywall, you know, our journal has a paywall. In other words, universities have to pay to get access to the journal. And for some scholars, and we've had problems with this, in particular Latin American scholars, they will not publish in our journal because there's a paywall. And you know, there's a politics to this. You know, so if you got some ethical issues about paywall, then you know you shouldn't be submitting to the Journal of Intercultural Studies. Maybe submit to open access journals. I don't know. Now the last one, who's your audience? So I think it's important who you're writing for. Are they academics? Are they theorists? Are they method scholars? Are they gender studies scholars? Make sure. And my final point really here is, when talking to your audience, make sure that they hear your voice. So this is one of the things I look for as an editor. I want to hear your voice. I don't want to hear the voice of others, right? So we want a strong original argument, a clear structure, and an audible authorial voice. I want to hear who you are. I want to hear your voice in that article, not the voices of the secondary sources, right? And I think Farita has already mentioned, you know, the reviewing. If you don't agree with some of the comments, then, you know, I think you should say why you don't agree. You know, once again, from an editorial perspective, when we get reviewers' response in, Pala and I highlight in particular which issues we want you to address. So we might say, well, look, referee 1 says a lot, but really we only want you to focus on these two issues. In referee's comments, more substantial, so we want you to address these 4 points, right? And then obviously as an editorial board, we read the resubmission and we look at the comments made by the referees and our comments and look at the extent to which you have addressed those comments. And if you haven't addressed in a very substantial rather than superficial way, then we go back and say, try again, right? So I'll stop there because I think the other points I was going to make, others have already made.
Thank you so much, Vince. so much really good practical advice there. I don't know where to begin, but I think we'll be able to have some more discussion about it in the question and answer part, which will be fantastic. But no, thank you for that.
Have I stopped sharing?
Thank you. I don't know. I think I was muted.
Sorry, Ashley, have I stopped sharing?
Yes, you're good.
Oh, good.
Sorry, I think I was muted then when I was speaking, but thank you so much. We'll hopefully have some more discussion about some of those points in the Q&A, but I thought it was really useful, especially in terms of responding to reviewer comments as well. There was some really good advice there, so thank you so much. So I'll start sharing my screen because I do have just a couple of really good resources that I came across in the late stages of my PhD, but also some community supports that I've kind of tapped into as well. And I found them really useful when publishing for the first time. And honestly, at any stage of your career, I think you can get a lot out of some of this stuff. A lot of the people that I've encountered who are using some of these same resources are at really varying stages of their career as well. So I hope that everybody will get a little bit out of this. So I will just open my notes and share my screen. It'd be good if I didn't just get out of the Zoom part. There we go. Okay, that should be all good now. So, so these resources that I want to share with you are, they surround books, podcasts, a couple of blogs that I've seen as well. And some, I think the support and community one is probably the most important. So I will probably have to skim over some of the other ones a little bit. But also co-writing groups, I found them to be really great. I've come across a few, and there might be people here that know of things that I haven't mentioned or that I might not be aware of. So feel free to drop some info about those in the chat or just let me know by email or something. Because what I will do is...
I don't think we've got screen share happening for you.
Oh, okay. I'll try that again. Try that again. Share screen. Oh. I don't know why it's saying that it is, but I'll double check. It's got only one participant can share at a time. Oh, here we go. I'll try this again. It's saying that it is, but I wonder if I can undo it and then, where is it? Hang on. It's really weird. Ah, I can't seem to get it to it won't let me do it anymore. Vin, are you able to just double check, Vince, that you're not still? Okay. Right.
Sorry, I didn't. Sorry, actually, it doesn't say that I'm sharing.
Okay. I don't know why it's not working.
I don't think it doesn't say that I'm sharing.
It just seems to be that I'm disabled from sharing the screen. It's not actually giving me the option to do it. So I thought maybe yours was still doing it because it was letting me before.
Ashley, there was a couple of questions in the chat. Would you like us to speak to them? While
what we might do is start with those. So
I have a couple written down.
Oh, sweet. That's awesome. I started writing them down as well. Yeah, that'd be good. While we try to work this out, I'll just mute myself and then see what's happening.
Maybe I'll just read them out and then any of the panelists can jump in.
That's awesome.
So
thank you.
There was a question at the beginning from Carl about navigating the kind of supervisor relationship and dealing with maybe Carl didn't use the word gatekeeping, but that was my shorthand, saying what do you do if your supervisor's trying to kind of holding back a draft from being submitted to publication, and where should you look for other advice and how can people navigate this? Which I think is probably an issue that a lot of HDR students struggle with, is kind of that up management of supervisors and knowing whose advice to seek and not wanting to go against them. Does anyone of our panelists want to start, or should I speak to that a bit? Or
You go, Sal.
I'm happy to say if you
as well.
Thanks. Look, I think part of that moving through the uncomfortableness of the quality of your own work is trying to get as many eyes on it as possible. And it can be really difficult. I don't know if I'm well placed to speak to the challenging supervisor relationship, because I always had quite a smooth relationship with my supervisor, so I didn't feel like we were ever really pulling in different directions. However, there was certainly, like, she was not so keen on a lot of the theories that I like to use. She wanted to keep it much more grounded. And so I had to fight quite hard to keep that in the thesis. And I think that what I try and do these days is just go to as many colleagues as possible for their feedback. At the end of the day, it's your name that's going to be on that paper. So take your supervisor's feedback, and I would be inclined to ask follow-up questions about why they don't think it's ready for publication and what their hesitation is around that piece of work. But your name is going to be the one published next to it. And if you want to get it out there, I think that at the end of the day, it is a solo career in that sense. You're going to have to stand up and believe in your own work. But it is challenging, like, if this is someone who you're going to have to continue to work with.
Can I add, from a supervisor's perspective, I tend to kind of respect the advice that a supervisor would be giving. So I agree with Sal that, you would want to know what it is that the supervisor thinks is a problem, and then you need to try to address it. If your supervisor is somebody who is well published, then they probably know what they're talking about, and so I think about it from the perspective of the best use of everybody's time. So is it fair to expect an external reviewer? So all of the work that goes into from the editors, the sub-editors, and the reviewers' time to tell you the same thing that your supervisor might have told you, or a set of peers might have told you. I would want to be very clear about, is there some reason why you think a supervisor is blocking you, or is this actually a legitimate concern that they have? And does your paper need more work before it gets sent out?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I've seen some varying perspectives on that sometimes if the issue is that there's actually some kind of issue that your supervisor has found with the paper, you probably are going to be better off really being able to have a discussion and nutting that out and actually improving the paper before sending it out, because sending it out, it's then going to go through that process of peer review that could take several months and then potentially not be fruitful. So I think that's really good advice, is that there's this delicate balance between, are you being blocked for a really good reason, and is there more discussion to have before you can kind of work it out. So I think it's it's sometimes good to play that long game for that reason, for that strategic reason. I did work out what was going wrong with the screen sharing, so I'll come back to and just kind of fly through this. The good news is that I am sharing this component of the presentation as a PDF. I'm going to put it together as a bit of a handout. So if I am, pouring through it really quickly, then don't worry too much about that. We'll have a chance to have a look at these resources in a bit more depth later on. So, and that's all working good for everybody? Okay. Okay, so first off, a couple of books that I found really useful, and these are very much, these have been very much focused on just the practical nuts and bolts of actually getting the work done and getting it out there. So some of you may have heard of Wendy Belcher's book, Writing Your Journal Article in 12 Weeks. I was gifted this for Christmas by my wonderful partner, and it's been such an amazing thing to have, because there's basically a section for each major component that you have to think about for an article. And Wendy Belcher gives so much great advice about almost like in checklist form of all these things to make sure you've done with your paper before it really is ready to send out. And it made me realize a lot of things that I wasn't really doing about making sure that there was a good enough amount of analysis, for instance, for everything that I kind of just described and threw in there as this is interesting. And so that really helped me make my analysis section more strong. And it also then forced me to kind of cut down on some of the areas where I was spending too much time setting it up, if that makes sense. So that's just one example, but there's so much great stuff in it, and it covers so many aspects of the process, from planning the article, from choosing the right kind of journal, from advancing, from writing the paper with that real argument-centered perspective, like Vince was talking about. And it's written in real plain language. There's a lot of humor to it and just a lot of practical tips. But there's also a Facebook group, a Writing Your Journal Article in 12 Weeks Facebook group that I've linked here. And so people that are working through the workbook give each other support and advice, but people also just write in with random, just any kind of issue that they want support with and get advice from each other that way, which is really lovely. So I found that to be a really good resource overall. And if the book is on the pricier side, but you can get older editions from it and secondhand versions. And there are people that have sold those within the group or that have shared excerpts from the that are available online as well. So there are other ways to access the content if the price is an issue, but it's a really good book and I recommend it. The dissertation to book is something that I've been going through to try to work out how to really rewrite my PhD as a book, because it's not something that you can, as Vince was saying before, and a few other speakers have said this as well, you can't actually just leave it in that thesis mode. There's so much more work that goes into adapting it for a book. And I found this to be written really well. There's a lot of just really, really good practical advice about how to make the book a little bit more accessible to a wider audience and to take out some of the over justification and explanation that we do tend to have, or that we need to have for a thesis that don't really need for a book with a broader audience. So I found that to be a really useful book. And again, it was written in this really accessible, lighthearted kind of way, and I really enjoyed reading it. And I'll just skim over this one, but I found the Subversive copy editor just recently. And I know it sounds like it's written for copy editors, but it is actually really, really useful for authors as well, and people who might be reviewing and giving feedback on other people's work. The tagline here that might be a little bit small to read, but it's that the Subversive copy editor, or how to negotiate good relationships with your writers, your colleagues and yourself. And there is so much fantastic advice just about the entire process of editing and giving other people feedback, but also how to kind of receive that kind of feedback and negotiate it yourself. So I got a lot out of it because, and the reality is as academics, that even though this session is mostly focused on our own writing and publishing, we will inevitably do so much reviewing and critiquing of others' work. And even we may even work in these editorial kind of positions where having these really good practical advice about how to manage all of that and the kind of challenges of all of that, I think is really helpful. So I really enjoyed reading this book, and I think that others here will hopefully do so as well. So I will try to go through these ones quickly, but Writing in Social Spaces by Rowena Murray, I've really enjoyed as well, because in a nutshell, this focuses on how important it is to seek out co-writing spaces and work with other people and be in other supportive networks with our academic writing. So there's a lot of practical advice about organising co-writing sessions and retreats and the like, but also just why that sort of thing is important and why working in isolation in writing, although we do have to do that a lot, and admittedly I wrote the majority of my thesis that way, but being able to be in an environment with other people whose ideas we can bounce off and support each other and kind of cheer each other on. There's a lot of benefit to that, and she talks about a lot of the research and literature surrounding that process of writing with other people. How to Be an Academic is written by the thesis whisperer, Inga Mewburn, and I'm going to talk a little bit about her blogs in a moment. So How to Be an Academic is essentially a collection of her best blog posts about all aspects of academic life, and I just really enjoyed it because it was just a really lighthearted read. And I also kind of feel like she's like the auntie, that wise auntie that we all wish we had, or that we all, or some of us maybe do have, but I just think that her advice is really solid and really interesting as well. And she talks about her own experiences as well. The John Acuff book, Finish, this is not specific to academia. It's more about meeting goals in general, from painting your house to running a marathon to starting a business. It could be anything. But its central premise was really relevant to academic writing because it basically, in a nutshell, it's kind of about how hard it is to get past that final hurdle of academic writing or of any goal, because we the imposter syndrome can kick in and we feel like it needs to be perfect before we can send it off. And while it is true that you want your work, you want to be confident that it's good enough, the reality is that there's no such thing as a perfect project. So it can really cripple us. And so he talks a lot about some strategies for dealing with that and for getting over that little last 5% hurdle to get your work through. And I found it really helpful for me because I was kind of sitting on some almost done articles for a while, and just being able to recognize when I was kind of stopping myself and when they genuinely needed more work was really good. So I recommend that one as well. So just a couple of podcasts and blogs that I find really interesting. So the Thesis Whisperer I've already kind of talked about, but I've included her Twitter handle, the Facebook page, and the blog itself. There's just a lot of really good, wise advice about publishing, but also just about working with other people, the academic job market, which I think is a whole several seminars in itself, just to talk about all of that. And I just think that Inga Mewburn's advice has been really helpful. So in general, I found that to be a really good source of support. And she tweets a lot of really interesting stuff as well that I found really helpful. So, and another one that not a lot of people have heard of, because it is very much America, US based, but it's still really interesting, is the Academic Woman Amplified podcast. So Kathleen Manzack is a tenured professor living in South America, and she has a writing coach business because she does a lot of work with other academics to help them with specifically with their writing and publishing. And I absolutely love this podcast because, and I engage with her blog and her Facebook community, which I'll talk about on the next slide, but her approach is she's very mindful of and resistant to this kind of toxic culture of overwork that can sometimes make us feel like if we're not constantly producing, that we're failing in some way. And she's very much about how can we write more while not feeding into that ideology. And I think that her podcasts are really interesting for that. And even though it is aimed at women and non-binary folks, I do think that even men can get a lot out of, or everybody can get a lot out of this podcast, because there is so much practical advice about managing your time, about breaking these huge, overwhelming writing tasks into smaller bite-sized pieces so they seem more achievable. There's a lot about project management kind of strategies and how important it is to kind of implement those when we're trying to finish big projects. And also just a really big part of it that I'm a strong believer is this idea that creativity and innovative thinking do really come from rest. And we can't really do our best work when we're operating at full tilt all the time. And so I do love that there is some focus about the realities of trying to make writing and publishing fit into your life, however it is, because we don't all have the same circumstances and access to resources. So I really love the focus of that. And her Facebook group is called I Should Be Writing, which is very tongue-in-cheek because it's actually the whole should component is what Kathy and her other coaches that give advice in the group, they're actually quite against that whole idea that we should always be writing. It's very much about fostering this really supportive community where people feel that they can give each other advice and talk about the real struggles they're having with their writing. And that whole culture of guilt and overwork is a big focus of all, like, I guess, addressing and trying to transform that culture to a more, to a place that sort of celebrates our wins and celebrates, you know, even the little victories without making us feel that we constantly need to be producing all the time. So it's a really good group. This is based for women and non-binary scholars, but don't fret because I do have a couple of other suggestions for resources that do include everybody. But another one that sort of was almost a spin-off of I Should Be Writing was that somebody in the I Should Be Writing group wanted to create a group where people could come together and organise their own co-writing sessions, as well as talk about some of the issues specifically that affect minority groups in academia. So this group is it's not just for women as I understand it, but it's for anyone who identifies as a group that's quite marginalised in academia. So I've noticed that there are people across the spectrum of different lived experiences, and they run a lot of peer-led writing groups. A lot of it's based in the UK, but there are some people in Australia, including one of my UWA former colleagues who runs a couple of sessions at more Australia-friendly times for those of you in Australia. So I found those groups to be really fun. So I'll include that link when I send this out to you as well. And this one's a bit more fun, but the Reviewer 2 Must Be Stopped Facebook group, it kind of is having a lighthearted jab at that idea that Reviewer 2 that kind of stereotype of the grumpy reviewer too that really wants to reject your paper and hates everything about it. But there are so many members of this group, and a lot of people do post questions about issues of publishing that they want support or help with. I do want to just put the caveat out there that there's about 30 or 40,000 people in this group from all different fields. So the advice isn't always fantastic, but sometimes it is. So like take it with a grain of salt sometimes, but at the same time, I found a lot of people in there to be really supportive and lovely, and it's well moderated. So whenever someone's like, you know, a little bit rude or things get a bit heated, it gets nipped in the bud pretty quickly. So most of the time I just find it to be a good source of humor, and there is some practical advice in there, which is has often been really nice. So, and a bit of an all-rounder here, just to kind of wrap it up, is the professor is in, because this, it'll sound like the book is mostly focused on how to get an academic job and the academic job market. And it is quite US centric, but at the same time, there is so much advice about how we choose to spend our time in terms of writing and publishing. And a lot of it is based on whether you do want a career in academia or not. So there's stuff about if you are planning to leave the academy or look at alternative careers, what kind of choices are best for you in that sense. But I've found that there's some chapters specifically on the kinds of publications to prioritize at an early stage of your career if you are wanting an academic career, and I found that really useful. They have a podcast as well as a blog, and they run a lot of webinars and actual services where they help people out with various stages of the whole academic job hunt. But a lot of their podcast episodes in particular and the blog posts do focus on academic publishing. A couple specifically are about making sure that—
1 minute.
Oh, that's cool. One of them was about responding to rejection and managing it when you feel, when you didn't get your article published and things like that. So I think that that's really important, because the reality is that we do all get rejected at some point, and we all will get our work critiqued, sometimes quite heavily. So there's a lot about managing that and responding to that, and how we kind of take some time to just be upset about it or be angry about it, and then get back up and get back into the mode of getting back in and writing. So I find their advice really fantastic. They also kind of remind me of the two wise aunties that you wish you had as well. It's Karen Kelsky and I think her partner, Kel Weinhold. They do a lot of really great work. And so this is just, I wanted to talk about some co-writing groups, and the links are here. So when I make a PDF of this, I'll send this out. But I go to both of these whenever I can, Side Project Sessions and Shut Up and Write. Both have chapters all over the world. So they're not necessarily in every city. There is a section for both where you can find your nearest one. But because of this pandemic, we've been doing so much stuff online. So there's been some really great online versions of this where you all get together at the same time via Zoom and do some writing in a supportive space. So Shut Up and Write is mostly academic focused. Side Project Sessions is just anyone who's working on anything that they want to knuckle down and do. So they call it this kind of like community focused peer pressure, a bit like in a nice way. And I enjoy both, and whenever I can physically go, I do go as well. And just in case anyone enjoys following, I know there's a lot of Twitter people in sociology, but there are some great hashtags that engage very much with academic writing, and they're saying the very same kinds of issues that we've talked about today, particularly academic chatter and academic Twitter, but there's also a few specific to the PhD and ECR experience that I enjoy as well. I think there's even one just for sharing photos of your pets. So I'm a big fan of that. And yeah, my dog is currently sitting on my feet. So he's a big sidekick for all of this. But yeah, I do very much. I know that a lot of us like to look at these. Again, it being the internet, we won't agree with everything that we see, and sometimes the advice might not be the best, but there is some really good, honest, candid discussion there, which I think is really useful. But just for this entire session, if people do have questions and feedback, please contact myself or the Social Equity Institute or both. Or even if you have suggestions of things to add to this list of resources, because I did fire through it really quickly and I know there's so many more. And yeah, we'll make it available to everyone who registered, whether you've made it here today or not, so you can have a bit of a look through. I'll include a bit of an annotation for each one about what they're about, and yeah, you can check it out and see how you go. But thank you very much. I'll stop sharing. Here we go. I can get, here we go. Where's my Zoom? Oh, it's because I've got you all minimized. There we go. Oh, trying to make you all big again. I'm not very tech savvy, so you can tell. There we go. Okay, cool. So we will get back to the Q&A. We do have, we were able to kind of foray into it a little bit earlier, but we do have a good 10 minutes to go through as much of that as we can. So I noted a couple of people sent through questions that they wanted to ask anonymously. So I'll start with that one. There was an anonymous question saying that this is about co-authoring with supervisors. The chapter is largely based on my PhD work, but it's been difficult to get the other co-authors who are very busy to respond and contribute. Their names are on the abstract proposal and I've had no response, but it's now overdue. Can I take the paper elsewhere? Can I take their names off it? Thank you in advance. So what do our panel think about that one?
I have, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't unilaterally take the names off. I would go back to the contributors and say, you know, I've been in contact with you a few times. If I don't hear anything back in the next week or so, then I might have to take your name off the publication. But I think you have to give them some warning. Once again, I don't know the context. But yeah, I would be very careful not to unilaterally take the names off the article or the chapter before you give them an opportunity to respond. And if they don't respond, then I think you probably can. I'm not sure about how much work each have put in. So maybe if the PhD student, is this a PhD student, was it? Oh, well, anonymous, we don't know. Yeah, depending.
Yeah, I think they were, it sounded like they were a student, but they may have been recently finished. It's not,
Yeah,
it's not 100%.
It may just depend how much work they put into it, you know, compared to others. So yeah, I'm not sure. Farita, maybe you might.
Yeah, I sort of have a mixed response, similar to Vince's, but I've had this experience not as a PhD, but as a research assistant, which research officer on a project where I did all of the work, collected all of the data, analysed all of the data and wrote the papers, and then couldn't get the CIs to actually just read the draft, I waited for a year asking them, read the draft. And then I told them, well, look, you know, again, out of respect for the people who've participated in this research, I think it needs to be published. I'm taking your names off, and you know that was that. With a PhD, it sounded like from the way the question was phrased, like this was a chapter directly from the thesis, and I would want to see that there was some value add being provided by the supervisor, such that it wasn't just the student's work, you know, and I know the supervisor has guided it and but also, yeah, you know, if you're going to, and each university has a definition of what authorship entails, and if the student can't genuinely say, and the supervisor genuinely say, yeah, this person has actually contributed to this written piece of work, then they don't automatically have a right to have their name on the paper, and certainly they shouldn't be holding up sending it off for publication. So a good hard conversation needs to be had, pointing to some of those resources, you know, the definitions, etc. And the student needs to say, well, you know, if you can't get your feedback to me by this absolute deadline, then, you know, I'm putting it in under my name or sending it to a different outlet or whatever.
Yeah, and I don't think you don't have to publish everything that comes out of your PhD with your supervisors. I think it might be a good pragmatic approach to do a little bit of both. I've done some of mine sole authored, but acknowledged my supervisors in the acknowledgement section, and the fact that they gave a lot of great guidance for the project. But one of my earlier articles I published with both of my supervisors and found that to be a really good experience. I was very lucky. Thanks, Farita. But at the same time, I know that that's not everybody's experience. And so I've heard of people saying, I feel like I could sole author publish this, especially I know it's difficult when it's the first one. And so I think it's possible to acknowledge their contribution, but remove them as co-authors if that's a major issue that you're just not getting. Yeah.
You know, with now on the progress reports that we have to do, the supervisors have to do for their PhD students, they regularly ask us to confirm that we have had discussions with our students about intellectual property rights, you know, which is basically a discussion around authorship. So this should be an ongoing conversation between the supervisors and the students.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. I think negotiating the politics of co-authorship is difficult, particularly difficult when you're a student, but it remains difficult, I think, at times. And I guess what I tend to do is start the conversation about co-authorship, not with, would you like to be a co-author, but would you like to make a contribution to this publication? So that it's very clear that you're not just gifting co-authorship to someone because they're around. And then the other thing, when people are sitting on papers for a long time and not getting back to you, I have a kind of standard hard line tactic. I sort of say, you know, I'm intending to submit this on X date. You know, if you can't get me feedback by then, please let me know when you can. And if I don't hear back from you, then I'll assume that you don't want to make a contribution. Yeah, therefore you won't be an author. So I think, yeah, it's something that I think remains difficult. It's always, there's a lot, and it's difficult because you don't want to offend people that you may need assistance from, and sometimes there's swings and roundabouts and people maybe get authorship that they don't really deserve. Yeah, so I think it's a really tricky thing to negotiate.
Thank you. Thank you all for some really great advice about that. And it is a tricky one. I think, yeah, if there's just not going to be a contribution from others, I agree, not including them as a co-author is sometimes the only way to see the paper forward. But at the same time, you want to make sure that paper's in really, really good shape and that you have like properly acknowledged any intellectual property that's gone into it. So there's a tricky balance, I think, as well. I do want to, there's a couple, I want to move on to another question. So we were asked by Alexa, what would be the usual expectation in terms of publishing post-PhD? So for instance, how many journal articles in the first year, second year, third year, etc.? Is there an expectation that there'd be a slow increase? And does it depend on the type of journal? So for instance, is 1 or 2 top tier better or the same as 3 to 5 in more mid-range journals? So what are people's thoughts on that?
I guess this is one of those ones where it can really depend on what your goal is at the end. If you are trying to position yourself to go for a DECRA or one of those other big, sorry, I'm assuming most of our audience is the Australian audience here. So if you're going for one of those big, you know, research grants, which is billed as an early career step, then you want to try and get as much out as possible, but the quality really does matter. Like I think a number of us have said, having a bunch of articles published in very low ranked or unranked journals isn't actually going to count for much at all. It may actually work against you in some cases. If you're looking, if your broader goal though is to secure, say, a TNR role, like an ongoing position, you might want to think about how diverse your CV is, because you might have a really strong research background, but you will also need to be, this is the fun of academia, you have to be doing everything all at once. So you're going to have to be thinking about making sure that you've got evidence of leadership and teaching as well, and course design. So it really depends what your goal is, because if you are hoping to get a TNR position, if you focus 100% on research, there are a few unis that I know will selectively hire purely on research outputs, but I think most universities are still looking for people who can kind of show at least some track record across those 3 academic portfolios that are still leadership, teaching, research. That would be my kind of thoughts about trying to make sure you've got a diverse CV happening.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on that one as well? Or are we all good? So there's another question that says, how could we avoid salami publication from the findings of our thesis? I've heard of that terminology used a lot in the STEM fields, sciences around when you've got one project and you publish different elements of the findings as separate papers. And I think in certain fields it's seen that's seen as problematic. I wondered if people, I'd heard that with the social sciences it's not so much of an issue because a thesis is so big and so vast that you couldn't possibly put all of it into one article, as Farita was talking about earlier. But I wondered if others wanted to weigh in on that. Is that a field-specific issue in your experience?
I'll comment on that in terms of my editorial role. I mean, yeah, I think from my experiences, there are cases where, you know, academics are trying to publish multiple articles based on one article that they've published. And so, you know, within the migration and ethnic studies community, you know, it may be large, but it's also small. And so sometimes we do get a sense that, you know, have I read this somewhere else, you know, and have I read the same argument somewhere else? So, yeah, I mean, we as editors do look for that. And so that is an unethical thing to do within the publishing industry. But yeah, I think it's, once again, if it is multiple publications, we make sure that at least the argument is different. The argument that you're making is different across these multiple publications. So that's my advice anyway.
Can I say something on that? Again, mostly agreeing with Vince, but it depends on what the level of your argument is. So, you know, I've been arguing that we need to get rid of the nation state. That's quite a kind of broad argument. And I've got lots of different data sets that support that I analyze in different ways to support that argument. So yeah, so I guess I'm less concerned about the whole salami thing. Partly because I trust people not to be publishing the same paper, basically. You know, that's kind of the bottom line. But you know, your data can be used in a lot of different ways to make different arguments, and you will you'll use different bits of data. So, you know, I've got some life narrative interviews, and I might of four of them as a case study to make an argument here. But I might write another paper that looks at issues that run across all of the interviews. I've got a number of articles that have come out based on data generated by focus groups. So it's the same data source, but these are completely different articles. So yeah, I don't really see it as much of an issue within the social sciences.
The other point I'd like to make is that, and you're right, you can make the same argument using different data sets, and that's acceptable. The other thing, oh, now I forgot what I was going to say. No, I've lost the point that was about. Maybe it'll come back to me in a minute. Sorry.
That's okay. If it does, you can always send it out to everybody. This was Vince's pearl of wisdom. Sorry, Karen. Was it Sal? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to add too. I mean, I agree. I think in general it's not a problem, and usually, I don't know. My experience is that I have more articles I need to write than I have time to write. But I have, as a reviewer, come across articles where people have clearly referred to other data that they haven't published that is really integral to their argument, and they're not giving it to you, and it's pretty obvious it's because they want to publish it as a separate publication. And as a reviewer, I find that really irritating and obvious. So I think, you know, you have to present all the data that you need for the argument that you're making in the paper. You can't, and to do otherwise, I think is salami slicing and not appropriate.
I also think with your PhD, it's such a large document that just think very strategically about how you want to do that, and don't wait until the very end. As you're writing this document, moving through it, think about the different aspects of it. Like when I think back to my PhD, I think I published like 5 different articles, and they were all very different. There was a theory article, there was an empirical, like a stripped down empirical piece, there was a gendered analysis that really didn't speak to anything else, there was a community development, you know, focused one. So I think planning and careful planning, because at the end of my PhD, I think I looked at it and I was like, well, I guess I can publish the empiricism and that's it. And it took me a while to realize, and even to this day, if I ever go back and look at my PhD, I'll find stuff in there and I'm like, oh, there's a lot more in here than I remember. So just, and maybe it's worth having that conversation with your supervisor about different aspects, that you're not just overlapping and it's not salami publishing, but it's getting the value because you put a lot of work into this. So just recognizing the different aspects of that.
Yeah, I find it, I think it's definitely going to be, this kind of issue is going to be very, you're going to experience it very differently, but depending on what kind of discipline and subdiscipline you're in. My work is almost across 3 different disciplines. And so there are so many different weird little corners of my data that I could go into. I could probably be publishing off this one project for you know, years, but I'll probably get tired of it, to be honest. But it's a really good point that you can be talking at, there could be such wildly different papers, even though they've come from the same data set or been kind of inspired by the same data set and the same major project. But yes, I think there's some really, really fantastic points that have been raised here. And I like the point that you raised, Karen, that as a reviewer, it is sometimes obvious when there's this really integral piece of information that you would need to be able to see in order to really assess what you're reading. So I think that's a really important point to take heed as well. There is a question about publishing opportunities that don't relate to your PhD. I do want to be mindful that we have gone a little bit over time, but I guess if anyone does want to just briefly speak to that before we wrap up, because today is based on publishing in general, so we don't need to be, it doesn't need to be focused on the PhD, but it might be nice to just maybe for someone to, if anybody has any points major points they want to raise about that one. So publishing outside of your own PhD field, so it's other side projects, I guess, is likely what we're talking about here. Anybody have anything for that one? It's quite a broad question. But...
No, well, I think you've got an opportunity to publish outside your PhD, and it works within, as Sal said, about, you know, where you think you're going and what you want to do. Then I think, you know, if that opportunity presents itself, then I think you should, you know, and if it fits within what you're hoping to do post PhD, you know, as Sal has already mentioned. So yeah, that's my point. Yeah, and I think it's normal to sometimes be involved in other projects while we're doing our PhD, or when we're wrapping up our PhD, that we it might be relevant in some way, or it might actually be a completely different project. But if that's where you're wanting to take your research direction, then fantastic. The project might be just as big, so a lot of this advice about how we kind of chop it up is likely to be really relevant to that as well. Or it might be a smaller project, in which case it might be a little bit easier to manage. But we do have to wrap it up there because I'm going to move into the co-writing session, and if anybody wants to join that, they're welcome to. Otherwise, this is now the end of the more formalized session. But I do just want to give all of the speakers a big hand again, because this was so fantastic, and I think that there's been so much really great practical advice and real talk, also just delivered in this really like compassionate and understanding way, that we're not all coming from this with the same experience, background, resources available to us. So thank you very much to all our speakers, and well done. For anyone who is sticking around, I'll get started with the writing session soon. Otherwise, thank you all, and send us an email, or drop us anything else in the chat that you want to raise, or that you want me to respond to later, and I can do that. Thank you.